go to Washington because the Trump administration released a significant document in the early hours of Friday morning without fanfare, press conference, just solely an update on the White House website. It is a newly published US national security strategy now being scrutinised by diplomats around the world. 33 pages setting out the Trump administration's vision to, quote, ensure America remains the world's strongest, richest, most powerful, successful country for the decades to come. In order to get it right, all Americans need to know what exactly it is we're trying to do, it says. It critiques what the president calls past globalist policies, overextended US resources, and it introduces the concept of, quote, Trump Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Well, the Monroe Doctrine goes back to the 1830s and President James Monroe, who opposed interference in the Western Hemisphere, that is North and South America, spelling out the American continent was off limits to outside interference. Well, this is being revised. Another core priority in the security strategy is titled The Era of Mass Migration is Over, asserting that past Western experience shows its strained domestic resources, increased violence and undermined national security. And there's a section too on the reframing of relations with each continent, which comes with a damning critique of Europe, where it cites economic decline being eclipsed by the prospect of civilizational erasure, and that the EU and other transnational bodies undermine political liberty, migration policies and censor free speech. It predicts that at the current rate, the continent will be unrecognisable in 20 years or less. Now, this US policy going forward, it says, should include, quote, cultivating resistance to Europe's current trajectory and be separate yet connected on Ukraine to bring about a speedy cessation in hostilities and prevent an expansion of the war. Let's cross to Washington. We can bring in Don Jensen, a US foreign policy expert specialising in Russian security and disinformation. Don's a former US diplomat negotiating on US, Soviet and Russian arms control treaties in the 80s and 90s, and also Associate Fellow of the Gino Germani Institute for Social Sciences and Strategic Studies. Great to have you on the programme tonight. Welcome to France 24, Don.
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you for having me.
Great to have you. Let's also bring in Leo Michel, US defence policy expert specialising in NATO and European defence relations as well, former CIA analyst, senior fellow at the think tank, the Institute for National Strategic Studies. Good to speak to you too as well tonight. Let's begin, both of you, with the extent to which this document is a surprise, what it tells us about President Trump's rhetoric and what goes further. Don.
Well, I think the reaction has been notably and remarkably different depending on which side of the Atlantic you live in. For at least for myself, this is not a surprise so much as a putting together of a lot of the Trump administration's foreign policy impulses over the past year. We should have seen it coming. And to some extent, we intuitively knew this was coming, but it's a very interesting document. I disagree with a significant part of it, and we can talk about that. But in Europe, I think this is a wake-up call that the era, the year, the months of trying to manipulate President Trump to get a foreign policy outcome that they want is now over. The call is really for Europe to stand up, Europe to respond if they can, and whether they can do that, I think, is to be seen. And I think that's why it's been such a shock, because we have to no longer, Europe has to no longer talk about Trump and where the continent seems to be going. It needs to take action, and now we have to see whether they do so.
Well, you hinted to it, Don. Talk us through the bits you disagree with.
Well, I'm an Atlanticist with grandparents from Europe, and I grew up and served in a U.S. administration, in plural, which believed in the value of the North Atlantic Alliance, the value of strength, and above all, something which is not mentioned at all very much in the document, is the threat that Russia poses not only to Europe's security, but to U.S. security. That, I think, is a major shift from past administrations, including the first Trump administration. For me, this marks a change in the way U.S. addresses the world, pursues its interests, and that has been a major, major change from to the continuity since 1989 and 91, when the wall fell and when the Soviet Union dissolved. That is now, I think, it's time for a different approach. Certainly, the Trump administration wants a different approach. Whether it works is to be seen.
Leo, just listening to Don, particularly when it comes to Don's talk of Europe and the very different strategy, prioritising in all senses. Leo appears to be business relations with Russia. What we've seen that in the rhetoric, but in writing in the vision, it's about basically, if we cut to the chase, Europe needs to get over its Russia problem, is essentially the message, isn't it? That Ukraine is to be sorted swiftly. Otherwise, this will be of detriment to, existentially, to Europe itself.
Well, I agree very much with Don's assessment here. First of all, the national security strategy is supposed to be a serious document. It has various audiences. One audience is the US government, the bureaucracy, really to set the tone and in the past with some detail on what American interests are and how we would pursue them. It's very different, as Don mentioned, from even Trump 1, his first administration. This very heavy emphasis on America first, the comments on Europe, which frankly, to me, resemble very much what Viktor Orban would say, not any of President Trump's predecessors. And I also share, sadly, I share the assessment that this should not be a surprise. We had a foretaste of this with the Vice President, J.D. Vance's speech in Munich in February, which I found very shocking, very aggressive, very wrong. And he followed it up, as you know, with meetings with the AfD in Germany. They were highly publicized. And this constitutes a type of, I could say, right-wing interference or right-wing support for right-wing elements in Europe that are very surprising and personally, to me, very disconcerting to see in the document that, as I said, should be a serious document. I would go one step further than Don, and that is that I saw no critical word, not one, in this national security strategy of the actions of the long-term strategy of Russia. I mean, Russia, let's face it, is the aggressor in Ukraine. Russia could stop the war today or tomorrow by stopping its assaults of hundreds of drone attacks and dozens of ballistic missile attacks every day on Ukraine. So I have grave concerns about this U.S. diplomatic push, if you can call it diplomatic push. And but in the longer term, this national security strategy, despite the throwaway phrase on the importance of alliances, I think will do much to confirm European doubts about the confidence it can place in this administration, at least, in terms of the capability and political will to work together as an alliance to safeguard transatlantic defense and security interests.
We talk about Europe because Europe comes in for a hell of a blunt set of critiquing. Don, just listening to Leo's point, one thing that I would say is that part of what President Trump's administration, this vision they're setting out, is true, is getting to a point in Europe where there are parties, there are governments in power that are wrestling particularly on this high agenda issue of migration. We've seen in the UK, Keir Starmer referring to the problems of Britain, his new Home Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, saying it's actually, this is an existential problem for the UK. Are they hitting on something as well that does get close to the problem? How do you see it?
Well, I do. Well, one of the interesting things about the document is the way that its comments on Europe in particular mirror to some extent the concerns of the MAGA base here in the United States. We talk about immigration all the time here in the U.S. One of the many remarkable things about this document is that they are now reaching out and essentially tell the Europeans, with whom we have many cultural and political affinities, of course, telling the Europeans how to govern their own countries. And that's really not isolationism as we classically understood it in graduate school. It's really quite something else. And again, what Leo said about the Russia issue is very true. And one of the remarkable things about the document, about the entire Trump approach to Russia, has been the extent to which the Kremlin narrative, the Kremlin, frankly, propaganda, disinformation approach strategy has taken root in the minds of some Western leaders. The issue of commercial activity over values, which Leo just talked about, the issue, frankly, of the Russian narrative about narrative and the way the war began. This is what some people worryingly say is, frankly, the Kremlin point of view. It's not factually true. And while everybody has the right to their opinion, as my old mentor, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, said, they don't have the right to their facts. And this, in that sense, this report rests on a house of cards that's simply not true. And that doesn't augur well for the success of the implementation of some of the things it recommends.
I think it's notable, Don and Leo, that there are no major European leaders that have spoken publicly about this, not given their assessment. We have heard from the High Commissioner on Foreign Affairs for the EU. Let's have a listen to Kaja Kallas.
You know, U.S. is still our biggest ally, and there I read it as well, that we are still the biggest ally, and it's in the interest of the United States as well that Europe lasts, and that we are really still the ally and working together for these things. I think we haven't always seen eye to eye on different topics, but I think the overall principle is still there. We are the biggest allies and we should stick together.
So that's Kaja Kallas. Leo, interesting. This is the reaction from Carlo Calenda, who's a senator, a centrist senator in Italy, saying this, quote, America is officially an adversary of democratic Europe. Europe needs to work out a way to disengage, and disengagement in terms of its approach to NATO, that is clear, the way that Europe is being put out on its own. What's your sense of what this means for NATO relations? We've had this conversation a lot. Is Europe not getting the message?
Well, I'm afraid it's gotten a very bad message there from this administration, really. I mean, I have not served in this administration. I retired from government in 2015. But someone who has, who's one of the most prominent experts in this country on Russia, is Fiona Hill. And Fiona Hill was a member of the National Security Council staff in the first Trump administration and witnessed a number of things, including this very terrible meeting, the summit meeting that President Trump had with President Putin in Helsinki in 2018. And when the first 28-point peace plan was released, leaked to the press, and that's how European leaders found out about it, she said quite forthrightly that this constitutes a betrayal of Ukraine and of Ukraine's confidence in the United States. It also constitutes a betrayal of Europe and of its faith that the U.S. was committed to collective security in Europe. And sadly, I have to agree with her assessment. I don't think that NATO is fated to fall apart. I don't think this is predetermined, but I think that these types of actions and statements, the way it's conducted, negotiations with Ukraine, the way Europe is portrayed in this National Security Council, National Security Strategy, I'm afraid is doing serious and long-term damage to our relations with NATO. And I would add to this, some of this is even institutional. We've seen effects on the role of the U.S. military. We've seen the purging, really, of experienced nonpartisan civil servants in the defense agencies and in the intelligence agencies in ways that are going to be very, very difficult to replace in the near term. And many of those people were experts, nonpartisan experts, and devoted to a strong transatlantic relationship. I simply don't see that having the upper hand in this administration. And I see, unfortunately, a very ideologically right-wing, tempted towards non-intervention, except in perhaps more and more in Latin America, where we always had harmonious relations, sometimes difficult, but more harmonious. harking back now to the Monroe Doctrine and the Trump Corollary, this is setting things back.
Well,
my last point in all of this is that
Yeah.
American soft power is having a terrible time now. Just look at the scenes of what the U.S. is doing with regard to forcing out undocumented immigrants in the United States, rounding them up, often by mistake American citizens, and the whole controversy over the Secretary of Defense, Mr. Hegseth, and his conduct of alleged anti-drug boat strikes in the Caribbean and in the Eastern Pacific. This is not doing very good service to the really the brave and honorable men and women of the U.S. Armed Services.
It's a very interesting point. Don, Leo talks about the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine, according to the Trump security strategy, is all in vogue at the moment. If you look at the Venn diagram of words, that probably comes out one of the top words talking about this new corollary, this new version of the Monroe Doctrine. Is it a thing in the US, Don? Is it something that the administration and administrations gone by have talked about, this idea going back to the former president, James Monroe, and protecting the continent of America? Because, of course, that also includes the influence from Russia and China, too, in Latin America.
Well, I was very glad you mentioned the Monroe Doctrine, because very few people have this week, even here in Washington. Because what you're seeing really is not a classical isolationism in a way, as Leo just said. You're seeing a pulling back to the Western Hemisphere. I'm not sure that's at all viable in the current age, but it's a very interesting strategy. Whereas a year and a half ago, we were talking about who's the greater threat, Russia or China. The focus then seemed to be on China. Events with Beijing have evolved to some extent in several directions at once. And now we're talking about maybe invading Venezuela. This is a very unsettling shift of priorities to happen so fast, with not a lot of public debate about it. So that's what I would say to your point. And again, you have to realize, and I think it's easy to forget, that according to polls, at least and last week, most American Republicans supporting Ukraine. Most Americans support a vigorous U.S. participation in NATO. But as Leo just said, that water in the river is already passed. So if it snaps back, it will have to snap back in a different way. And that, of course, means a more vigorous European engagement in NATO's activities. As Leo also said, and I agree, the alliance, I don't think, is about to fall apart. It's just that it's a victim of global forces which it has not yet fully adapted to. And that's one of the main challenges in the years ahead.
Very briefly, Don, you've dealt with Russian negotiators in the past. If you were sitting on the other side of the Atlantic, if you were in the Kremlin right now, what would you be thinking of this doctrine, of this strategic plan? Happy birthday.
I think they're going right with the Kremlin. Is that for Leo or myself?
No, for you, Don.
Okay, I think that they will probably assess this as going right where they have the U.S. or right where it wants to, which is to say, you don't have to have a war in Europe. You just manipulate so-called hybrid power to get the adversary to go in the direction you want. And that's a pullback from Europe. That's a weakened NATO, and that's a subjugated Ukraine. And that's what they want. They've not really changed their goals at all since the beginning of the war, almost 4 years ago now. They have not really changed. What changes is their adaptability to developments on our side. And they're very good at that. They have by no means won, because one of the things that's been ignored this week is Russia has a lot of military vulnerabilities and liabilities themselves. Those need to be exploited by the West, and we'll be able to do that better with a more cohesive, imaginative, and distinctive leadership, not only here, but especially now in Europe, because the ball, as they say in U.S. basketball, is now in their court. And that's where we have to go now.
Don, Leo, great to talk to you both tonight. Thank you. John Jensen, US foreign policy expert, former US diplomat, and also Leo as well, the Associate Fellow at the Gino Germani Institute of Social Sciences. Speak to you both again soon.